All right, Scott, you're on, buddy.
Okay. Well, what I wanted to go over today are what I consider the five tips for listing and selling manufactured homes. It's actually a condensation of the 3 hour class that I teach. So all of that is condensed into five tips. And I think when we talk about manufactured homes, and this is anytime I talk about manufactured homes and listing or selling a home, it is setting up the right expectations for the seller and the buyer, because these are just unique, and there are other items that are needed in order for the transaction to close successfully. So
Okay.
we'll start with number one, and tip number one. That's the one everybody is familiar with. Is do we have a deactivated title for this manufactured home? And typically, we're always going to default to asking for a deactivated title because all of us within the real estate industry, what we deal with is real estate. We don't deal typically with personal property. So everything is usually defaulted to real property. And the first part about a home being considered real property is the manufactured home titled, and is it deactivated with motor vehicle? We split that up into two questions because there are a lot of manufactured homes that are out there that have never been titled with motor vehicle. There was a misconception out there that if a home was going to be put immediately on a permanent foundation, it didn't have to receive a title with a motor vehicle, and that's not correct. So the statute says that manufactured homes, and there is no exception of the statute, they have to be registered with motor vehicle, which means a title has to be created. And in order for us to go ahead and determine what the status of the title is with motor vehicle, we need the serial number. And the serial number is what is created by the manufacturer, and it becomes the VIN number on the title with motor vehicle. It's kind of interesting that when you talk about a car, it's always a VIN number from day one on, and everybody considers it a VIN number. But manufactured homes, it's a serial number that just gets put into the VIN number spot on a title. So we need that information to determine, okay, is it titled, and is the title deactivated with motor vehicle? And I'll talk some more about when we get to tip number 5 about, well, what if we don't have that number?
Yeah, that was
How
going to be
can
my question there, because I know sometimes they're hard to find too, right?
Right, and we'll and all when we go to tip number 5, I'll go ahead and talk about that, even though that's really more of a lending requirement. But number 5 also allows us to go ahead and get the serial number for the manufactured home. This will be for tip number 1 and tip number 2. If the home is already taxed as real property and we don't have any information, I always like going to the assessor's office, because that's one of our free options. I always like to exhaust all the free options first before somebody has to pay for something in order to get the information that we need. So tip number 1 is the title and the deactivated title with motor vehicle. Tip number 2 is the manufactured home taxed as real property by the county assessor's office? So in New Mexico, in order for a manufactured home to be considered real property, it's in the way it is taxed. So it has to be taxed as real property. But when you look at the rule on taxing as real property, the last part of the rule says that the county assessor has to have been provided with a copy of the deactivated title. So what we mean by that is we can never guarantee that just because the home is taxed as real property, that the title is deactivated. Each sum of the part has to be reviewed and investigated to determine if everything is complete. Because I have a lot of people saying, and even I'll get this from title companies, oh, it's taxed as real property, so it must have a deactivated title. And no, the only way we're able to verify that is to check with motor vehicle and determine if the title is actually deactivated. And with motor vehicle, the status is called inactive, which means deactivated. So on tip number 2, on it being taxed as real property, sometimes we can take a look at the tax bill. And when we look at the tax bill, you'll usually see, okay, the land value, you'll see improvement value. If the improvement value is pretty significant, then, we're kind of getting to the ballpark that, yeah, it probably is a real property, but nothing beats getting a letter from the county assessor that says, yes, we are taxing as real property. I had one in Santa Fe County that when we looked at the tax bill, the improvements that were being taxed were such an amount that it looked like, oh, yeah, it does look like it's being taxed as real property. Well, when we investigated further, it wasn't the manufactured home. It was a really, really nice garage that they had built. And that was the real property improvement. So we still had to go ahead and, figure out what is the taxation status with the county. The other thing that we find sometimes is, let's say we pull up the tax bill, and our tax bill shows only land is being assessed. And sometimes in our different counties, we already have kind of an idea about that if we see a tax bill and the tax amount is very, very low relative to other properties that have a home on it. There are times when the original owner of the home never rendered this for assessment. It was never picked up as real property, and the home was never put on the tax rolls. The most popular place that I find this is in the East Mountains on the Santa Fe County side, because that East Mountain area is far removed from the assessor's office in Santa Fe. I don't find it as much in the East Mountains when it's Bernalillo or Torrance County, because they're closer and they get out. But I have seen homes that were never rendered for assessment. The one that always sticks in my mind was a bank-owned property. And so when that buyer, after they purchased the property, tried to go and get what they needed from the county to go ahead and get a title in their name, the county came back and said, oh, we've never rendered this for assessment. And because this home has been out there at least 10 years, we're going to go ahead and create an omitted assessment, and buyer, or new owner, you are going to have to pay 10 years worth of taxes. Because the statute doesn't allow them to go back any further than 10 years, but they can go back 10 years. And Santa Fe County has been the county that I think is one of the more stricter counties. Some of our other counties, yeah, could they go back 10 years? I have one county that's like, oh, no, we're just happy to get it on the tax rolls now and bring it forward. And then I've seen other counties that will maybe go back 3 years. But the counties that go back 10 years, what they typically say is, we need to go ahead and collect those taxes on behalf of the taxpayers, and where this tax money goes to, like, schools. And so they don't want to be harsh about it, but they're like, no, there's a responsibility that these taxes should have been collected. And when you look at the statute, it's the owner, the first owner of the home. They are required, no matter if anybody else does this for them, they are required to go ahead and make sure that this gets rendered for assessment with the county. That one in the East Mountains I was talking to you about, the broker helped pay those taxes because it was going to be more of a reputational risk to them than anything else. But it was a good example of, wow, it's not even a real property because it was never put on the tax rolls. So number 1 and number 2, I think, are the ones that we're most familiar with: deactivated title, and is it taxed as real property, and always verifying the sum of the parts and getting it straight from, pardon the expression, straight from the horse's mouth. So from motor vehicle and directly from the county assessor, and it documented. The third tip is whether the home is deactivated tax as real property or not, typically, especially if there's a lender involved, a foundation inspection is going to be required at the very least by certified by an engineer. And so sometimes the lender will go ahead and make that determination for all of us. But even on a cash transaction or a real estate contract, it could be required contractually. And so when we're talking about an engineer going out there, the engineer is always going to look at what the current standards are. So you may get a home that was put on a permanent foundation 20 years ago. The engineer goes out today and says, yeah, so that foundation was good 20 years ago, but now you're going to have additional tie downs. And so what they're going to do is they're going to write a repair letter. They're going to say, take this repair letter to a contractor, have them do the work. And when it's done, we'll go ahead and reinspect and issue a clean letter. So that's it. That's it. You know, we have a deactivated title. It's taxed as real property, but for whatever reason, we're required to get a current engineer certification. But let's say the home isn't taxed as real property, and so we are going to go through the process of taxing as real property, deactivating the title. In some counties, we'll have to go ahead and get the state inspector to go out there if it's going to be converted from personal property to real property. If it's an existing home, you still have to get an engineer to go out there because the engineer certification has to go along with the permit application to the manufactured housing division. This is where it gets really tricky because if you've ever seen some engineers report, they will actually say, we are only certifying to maybe the HUD guidelines. We are not certifying to the any state standards. Where this becomes kind of frustrating is, let's say the foundation is perfect. Foundation is perfect. However, we know that when the state inspector goes out there, they're going to make a comment on, oh, there is not enough venting around the home to make sure that it's dry, or the skirting is damaged. And so while the foundation may pass, or it would have passed, when the inspector goes out there, because one of their duties is safety, and they have a duty to make sure this home is habitable and safe, they can fail the foundation inspection if they notice anything else. They can't unsee what they see. And so a lot of times, if we know ultimately that we're going to have to get a state inspection, and by the way, the state inspection is the green tag, then we want to make sure that the engineer who goes out there and does the work, or whoever's doing work on behalf of the engineer, they know what the state requirements are. Because there's nothing worse than us getting close to closing, and now all of a sudden, state inspector goes out and says, yeah, foundation was good, but here's everything else you're going to have to correct. Now we have to get those corrected. State inspector has to come out, and it's just pushing our timeline further and further out. And I always like to talk about number 3 is should that be a requirement, and should there be any repairs? Got to keep in mind who's going to go ahead and pay for those repairs, and are we going to have enough lead time before we start getting close to the closing date in our contract. And I see some listing brokers, especially that are really, really familiar with manufactured homes and have just done it so many times. They'll actually take care of most all of this before they even go under contract. And probably because they've had issues before in the past where it was, we'll do this once we go under contract. I like to say that Murphy's Law is, we think we're going to have plenty of time to do this after we're under contract. All of a sudden, we get the best offer in the world that's cash, and they want to close in a week. And we haven't even started on any of that. And the contract is calling for that buyer wants the deactivated title, proof that it's taxed as real property. Is it on a current foundation? So those are the Murphy's Law type situations that will come up. So that's number 3, is the foundation. Number 4 is what I call now the deal killer. So most lenders will require, except anecdotally, I've heard that this doesn't apply to VA loans, but conventional FHA, most lenders want proof that the home has never been moved. And what they mean is the home could have been bought brand new and moved from the dealer's location to the first location it was lived in. If it moves one more time after that, it disqualifies it from a lot of conventional, and definitely it's always been an FHA requirement. And so the question will be, how do we prove that the home has never been moved before? Lenders will, depending on the lender, they'll want either one of two things. One is some lenders will accept an engineer's certification that the home has never been moved structurally. And really, it only works on multi-unit homes. So double wide, triple wide, quad. What the engineer is looking for is to see if the marriage line has been disturbed between each of the sides. Now, I say a multi-unit home or higher. I did see an engineer opine on a single wide that had never been moved. And I'm thinking, so what is it married to? The dirt? Because how can you tell? And single wide, they can be more difficult in themselves, because sometimes finding a lender that will loan on a single wide is an issue. So structurally, it's the engineer, but because it's an engineer's opinion, and depending on who the engineer is and the lender's experience and their risk appetite, they may say, yeah, I need something else to go along with the engineer's opinion. Within the last year, I actually saw an engineer that had an opinion that the home had never been moved before. When we further investigated, it had been in another county. And so now that lender is like, well, do I ever trust an engineer certification again on their opinion? So the other way is to be able to prove by documentation. And both of these ways, again, really goes back to what is the lender's risk appetite, and are they willing to go ahead and fight this later, especially if it should go into foreclosure and they are having to convey to HUD, and they have to prove to HUD, yes, we did do our due diligence, so that HUD doesn't say, oh, no, we don't like it. We're going to reconvey this back to you. Now you are stuck with this loan. So when we're talking about documentation, the platinum document that we always try to look for, but a lot of times we can't find, is the original purchase contract from the manufactured home dealer that shows this was a brand new home and it was delivered to our address. Now that works if your seller was the first owner of the manufactured home and they saved their paperwork. Typically though, you're dealing with the third, fourth, or fifth owner, and they're like, we have no idea what you're talking about. Sometimes we might be able to find that in a prior closing, that documentation. But even when we have that document, if this home went out to a rural area, a lot of times those addresses weren't even set up. And so what you see on the dealer's contract is 1/2 mile from county road, whatever, which, okay, it gets us there, but it doesn't identify it. And sometimes even if there was an address on that in the rural areas, just, in all of our experience, how many rural addresses got changed because of the 911 rural addressing system? So sometimes, we can connect the dots, but a lot of times we don't have that document. So if we don't have that document, now we're having to go to what I say, the second level documents that when they're accumulated together, give somebody a reasonable, assumption that the home has never been moved before. So the first thing that I would always ask for is, let's say that this was a 2001 solitaire home. What I would look is to see, okay, was there a mortgage or a financing document filed of record in 2001 that would lead me to believe, yes, this was the mortgage that was used to go ahead and either purchase the home, or it was the permanent financing for the manufactured home. Every now and then we get lucky and we find the original construction mortgage, because some of the local banks that used to do these back in the day, like People's Bank, they would actually do a construction mortgage. And we would look at the date of that mortgage, look at the model year of our home, and hey, it makes sense. And then usually, a few months later, we actually find the permanent financing. So this would be an FHA loan, a mortgage, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. So we would find the permanent, and we're thinking, okay, we're good to go. So let's say that original owner purchased this cash, or they received a chattel loan, and so there's nothing of record that lets us know. So now it can become a little bit more challenging. If it is rural property and if it is on a septic system, I always ask, okay, so let's say it's that same 2001 home. Was there a permit for a new system in 2001? And when we get an actual copy of that permit from EID, or if you're dealing with a property in Bernalillo County, you have to get it from Bernalillo County since they do their own permitting. A lot of times, the ones that we can use, it'll actually say a new system. And when you look at the map, sometimes it'll say a proposed manufactured or mobile home. And now I'm thinking, okay, now along with the year of that home, that makes sense. But let's say that you're on a real piece of property and it's an unpermitted system. They did not permit it. For whatever reason, this got missed. Well, that's now out of it. In rural areas, especially if there's like an electric co-op, I will look for an easement. So let's say the same 2001, an easement in 2001 to go ahead and put up the pole for that home. So it's something filed of records that I'm like, okay, that may help me. But let's say we're in a city or municipality, and so it's on city sewer. It's on, this worked. I've only had this work once. It was in Aztec. So this was for our purposes here, we'll stay with the 2001 home. 2001 home, they got a letter from the city of Aztec that said, we first turned on utilities in 2001. We had no utilities on that property before then. And so that along with the year of the home made us feel more comfortable. I can tell you, the older the home is, the more difficult it is to prove that it's been moved using documentation. For some reason, and this is just anecdotally in my experience, homes that are older than 95 become more difficult. Not impossible, though. I had a 1978 home in Bernalillo County, and we found the original financing statement filed of record in the clerk's office, and it had the dealer on there. Everything matched, and we were able to go ahead and use it. So we do get lucky, but it does become more difficult. On those older homes, typically we're having then to rely on what the engineer's opinion is, if that lender is willing to go ahead and accept that opinion. And some engineers will just go ahead and issue that along with their letter. But it's always, okay, the eye of the beholder as to who's going to go ahead and accept that. And a lot of people will ask me, especially, let's go number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, Scott, if we don't do any of this, will it matter? And my answer back to them is, in theory, the more of these that we have, in theory, we cast a wider net when it comes to buyers. Because we start missing some of these, and maybe it's somebody who will never move, or they just intend on renting out this property forever. Or we may get lucky and it's an investor or somebody that just wants the land and they just need the title to go ahead and move that home off of there. But it shrinks our pool of buyers smaller and smaller when we're missing items. But I would say if we think that we want the pool of buyers to include somebody who's going to be getting financing, working on proving that it's never been moved, that should be really the first step. Getting a deactivated title, it can take some time. You know, it can take a little bit of time, but it's not impossible. Getting a tax as real property is not impossible. Putting it on a retrofitted foundation, not impossible. It is the proving that the home has never been moved. That's our big issue. And so I always recommend start working on that now. I actually will have investors that intend to go ahead and fix this up and flip it and sell it, and they want to make sure that it is financed, that it can be financed by anybody. That will actually call me up and say, "Hey, Scott, I'm about to put a bid on this property. Here's some information. Can you tell me quickly if it's ever been moved before I go ahead and put in the bid?" And these are investors that are really familiar with manufactured homes, and so they know, hey, I want to know this. Otherwise, I'm stuck. You know, the other thing I hear is if you can't prove the home has never been moved, is we'll just find a cash buyer or we'll sell it under a real estate contract. In theory, that will work. My recommendation to a broker is, get with your qualifying broker and make sure that you have protected yourself. Because a cash buyer will turn around and try to get a loan, try to pull some money out. And if they go conventional, this may pop up. Or if it's under a real estate contract, and especially if somebody puts a balloon on it and says, you must pay us off in, a certain amount of years, if they're going to try to use a conventional loan to pay it off, and they discover, it had been moved before, and this wasn't properly disclosed to them, they're going to try to come back on somebody. And we know how fickle people are, because people will come back and say, well, the only reason I purchased this manufactured home was so that I could do something in the future. That's what they'll say later when it's discovered that the home has never been moved. And homes that have been moved, so you may say, okay, well, under what circumstances does that occur? The most popular one is I buy a manufactured home, I live in a park, a mobile home park for a year, and then I buy my dirt and I move it onto my dirt. It's already been moved. Or, hey, this was a repossessed home. I went to one of the local dealers. It was a used home. I bought it for cheap, and I'm putting it out on land that I bought. Because if it's repossessed and if it's already at the dealer's lot, it means that it moved from somewhere to the dealer's lot. If it's a foreclosed home and it was a foreclosed piece of real property and the home has never been moved, then that's a different thing. But yeah, if I buy a used home from a dealer's lot, yeah, it had to have been somewhere, and those immediately disqualifying. So there are times when it comes to documentation, there are three options that we see on documentation. It's yes, we can prove that it's never been moved before and we're comfortable with it. The documentation comes back and we're like, oh yeah, this was in a park. And sometimes how I can tell that is if we find a copy of the original title and it has an address that says space number 44, well, that was pretty easy. So right then we proved it had been moved before. The one that's frustrating is we can't say one way or another. We don't have enough documentation to say that it has been moved or hasn't been moved. Those are the frustrating ones. At least with the first two, we know either way. It's the one, and it's the older homes that sometimes we get into that third category on. We just don't have enough documentation if we're required to use documentation to prove that the home has never been moved. So number 5 is, and this is typically for lending purposes. And when I say lending purposes, this usually goes to the appraisal. So if we are dealing with a manufactured home that has been manufactured after 1976, that manufactured home, per federal law, was required to have the HUD label, so the metal tag on the outside of the home. And each unit of the home would have had its own HUD label. And that label has a number on there. That number it has nothing to do with the manufacturer, which means it's not the serial number. Because I'll ask people, well, do you have the serial number? Oh, I do. And they send me a copy of their HUD tag. And I'm like, well, no, that's not it. It could help us get it, but that's not it. So the HUD labels. If it's a double wide, the lender and the appraiser wants to see both numbers. Triple wide, they want to see 3 numbers. So if any of them are missing, now we have to go ahead and go to and mitigate that. And I'll talk about that in a moment. The other item on all homes after 76 is they would have had a data compliance certificate. So this is a piece of paper that's affixed inside of the home that gives information on the manufactured home. It actually gives us a lot of good information. It gives us the serial number of the home, when the home was manufactured, who the manufacturer was. One of the reasons why the federal government wants it on there is, and typically this doesn't do us any good and we don't pay attention to it, but what it does is if you ever look at one, it will show you some different maps of the United States. Those maps represent different areas where this home was manufactured, where this home was supposed to be installed based on wind zones. So what's the maximum wind that this home can take? A home that's in a lower wind zone is not designed to be put along the Gulf Coast where we're going to see hurricanes. Alternately, we have roof load zones. So a home that's along the Gulf Coast is probably not the best home to be in Ruidoso, in Chama, where we will get heavy snows that could collapse the roof. So that's what's supposed to be on there for where it's supposed to be sold. Again, that doesn't really do much for us, but that's one of the reasons why this document has to be inside of the home. Now, the most popular places for to locate these inside of homes is in any of the kitchen cabinets. So that would be inside the door of the kitchen cabinet, whether it be above or below the sink. The other places are near the electrical panel, so the main inside electrical panel, sometimes in the main bedroom closet. And I've seen at least one manufacturer, and this is Cavco, would put theirs where the washer and the dryer hookups are. Now, sometimes we can see that there was a data compliance certificate there because somebody ripped it off at one time and we see the paper that was there. So let's say something is missing. So typically if one of these are missing, especially for lending purposes, that lender is going to require the duplicate information be ordered from a place called IBTS. And so that's the Institute for Building and Technology Safety. After 1976, all manufacturers were required to report into HUD certain things. And this would be the HUD numbers, when the home was manufactured, and what is the manufacturer's serial number that goes along with this home. So it marries up the HUD label numbers and the serial number. And so let's assume for a minute, when I talk about tip number 1, nobody is able to find a serial number. In fact, when you ask your seller, do you have a copy of the manufactured home title? What they'll usually do if they're the 4th or the 5th owner, especially if they purchased it, I would say more than 10 years ago, they'll bring out their deed and say, well, that's my title. That's all I got when I closed on this, which now we know, okay, we're going to have to do a little bit of work. So now we're not too sure what our serial number is that we can run through motor vehicle. If we had the HUD labels on the outside of the home, setting aside what the lender may require later, we may have to go ahead and order that IBTS letter now so that we can get the serial number to run through motor vehicle and determine what the status of the title is. So that allows us to go ahead and do that. And actually, so what IBTS provides is a HUD verification label letter. It actually is used to, identify all the HUD label numbers, but it gives us the serial number, and it's a cheaper product. So sometimes we just use it for what we need to go ahead and get the serial number. The other item that they provide is the duplicate data performance certificate, aka data compliance certificate, that replaces or substitutes for the paper inside of the home that was removed. Now, any home prior to 1976 will not have these as defined in the federal rule. Because sometimes I'll have a broker say, hey, Scott, we have a 1972 home, but we need to get the HUD labels. So do I call IBTS? And I'm like, no. If you spend any money with IBTS, they're gonna at least charge you a minimum fee and then turn right around and say, this is a 1972 home. That's prior to the federal rules. You'll also see that that in general, homes prior to 1976 will not qualify for conventional financing. Because typically the first thing is it has to be after 1976, where it would have been manufactured to the federal manufactured home construction and safety standards. And then you get lenders that are more selective and will say we'll only loan on double wides, and it has to be 20 years older or less. So you'll get that. But definitely if it's prior to 72, you may get a credit union or maybe a bank that's going to keep the loan on their book. But at that point, that buyer is not going to be able to get, into any type of good down payment program. And they may not be able to get the best interest rate that they can for that loan. They may still be able to get a loan, but the lending, that pool of lenders has now really shrunk. So those are the 5 tips. And again, number 4, if you think that, okay, we're going to go after buyers that are going to get financing, number 4 is the one that I would always recommend that somebody works on first, or keeps in mind that we need to keep working on that immediately. When we take the listing, let's go ahead and start seeing if we can go ahead and determine that it's never been moved while we work on the other items as well.
Man, that was that's great, man. That brings up a lot of stuff, like a lot of deals that I could have done much easier, right? But yeah, man, no, that's great, Scott.
I have a question. Do you have your private investigator's license?
No, I don't. But what I like on number 4. So that's actually a so deactivating a title and helping to prove that a home has never been moved. So those are 2 services that I provide through my company. But no, because a lot of what I do, especially number 4, may be in the public record, then it's easier. Yeah. But sometimes what we have to do is not necessarily a private investigator, but there are times where we have to send a certified VIN inspector out to a home because we just can't find anything, and we actually want them to go underneath the home. So what I didn't say earlier is that on a home after 76, the manufacturers were required to stamp the serial numbers on that first metal beam that would be right behind where the hitch would be. The issue is sometimes getting underneath the home to find that, and some manufacturers only place a partial number on there, like the last part. And so then we're missing the first part, and we don't know, okay, what would it, what was the full number so that we could go ahead and run through motor vehicle. So Karsten, before they sold to Clayton Homes, they would stamp their I have seen their full number stamped vertically on that beam, and it was really easy. but some manufacturers, I just see the last four. And if it's a manufacturer that we're not familiar with, or we don't know where it was manufactured, because some of these manufacturers in their full serial number, like a Fleetwood, shows TX for Texas, FL. They'll show a 3-digit number, which is the plant number, before they get into what the specific number is for that home. So you have a lot of that other stuff that would be part of the full VIN number, but we don't know. If we're missing a lot of things, we don't know what all it would be. And for me, for example, the interface that I have with motor vehicle, I can only run VIN numbers, serial numbers, and plate numbers. I can't run it by name. And even I was able to run it by name. If somebody had multiple manufactured homes and we weren't too sure what the make and the year of it was, it still may not do us any good. And let's say we're pretty sure we know who the original owner is. And somebody goes into motor vehicle and says, was there a title under this person? Motor vehicle will typically say, yes, there was. And so when somebody asks, okay, well, can you go ahead and give me that information? They will say no, unless you're the original owner. And the reason is, and this is the frustrating part, is because motor vehicle exists, all of those records exist behind the curtain of the Driver's Protection Act, so that federal act. And it's because of where manufactured homes sit that we can't get this information. In Texas, they moved all of that out of motor vehicle into their Department of Housing and Community Affairs and made it all public record, because this has to do with homes. This has to do with real estate. But yeah, because this information exists with driver's license records, social security numbers, yeah, it's hard to get anything by name, and I can only run it by a full VIN number, which sometimes is the issue. Somebody will call me up and I'll say, I'm happy to help you, but we're gonna have to get that full VIN number. I had one. This brings up a good example on, well, where are other ways we can find it? When you get outside of what we talked about here, then it becomes an issue on, can we rely upon what we've seen? So somebody sent me an appraisal yesterday. A lender from out of state that's doing a loan here in New Mexico sent me an appraisal. I saw the VIN number. It was a Cavco, except it was really short. And so I was thinking it was missing a number. And so this is what they typed on the first page of the appraisal. So I said, okay, it says that they pulled this off of the actual data compliance certificate. Someone needs to send me a photograph of it, because I need to see it directly from the actual home itself, not somebody's typing of it. Once I got it back, they were missing a number. They were missing one of the numbers. And somebody provided me a copy of their insurance policy. Well, the insurance company said it was a Karsten home, but the number that they were referencing is not any Karsten home I've ever seen. And so I said, yeah, in order for us to go ahead and, try to use that, we'd have to know where they got that from. And if they got that from the home, just give me the document from the home and let's ignore the insurance policy. So sometimes those will come up, but it still requires us to go ahead and verify directly from the source what our full and correct number is, especially if we're not locating anything within motor vehicle.
Wow.
Hey, like I always say, if Scott can't do it, it can't be done. That's what I
Exactly.
always say.
Yeah.
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 And I believe it. So I really appreciate you, Scott, stopping in and helping us out, man.